Ryan Coleman had ironed his one good shirt 3 times that morning, not because it needed it, but because his hands needed something to do besides shake. He stood outside the glass tower on 5th and Cooper for a full 2 minutes, before he made himself walk through the revolving doors, past a lobby so polished he could see his own nervous reflection in the marble floor, up an elevator that rose 31 floors without a single sound, into a waiting room where the receptionist's smile looked as expensive as everything else in the building. He had told his daughter Sophie that morning, over a bowl of cereal she barely touched because she'd caught his nerves the way 7-year-olds always catch things they're not supposed to, that this was just an interview. Nothing to worry about, Daddy does this all the time. It wasn't true. He hadn't interviewed for anything in 4 years. Not since the operations manager job he'd walked away from to take care of his wife, Angela, in the last stretch of her illness, and then to take care of Sophie in the wreckage after, working nights, stocking shelves, and driving for a delivery app, because those were the only jobs that let him be home when his daughter needed him and absent when she was asleep. Warehouse and logistics work had been his whole career before that, and Whitman Freight Solutions was hiring an operations manager. A real salaried position with benefits, the kind of job that could finally get Sophie out of the cramped apartment, over the laundromat and into a school district, with a real music program, the one she'd been begging to join since she heard a violin at a school assembly. He needed this. He knew he needed it too much. And that kind of need has a way of showing up in a person's hands and voice no matter how hard they try to hide it. The interview started well enough. 2 junior managers walked him through his resume, nodded at his years running receiving docks and inventory systems for a mid-sized distributor, seemed genuinely impressed by the efficiency numbers he'd once helped shave off a supply chain that everyone else had given up trying to fix. Then the older woman on the panel, a director named Diane Foster with sharp reading glasses and an even sharper pen, tapped the paper in front of her and asked him to explain the 4-year gap. Ryan had rehearsed an answer for this exact question a dozen times in the mirror, something professional and tidy about caregiving responsibilities, but sitting there under fluorescent lights with 3 strangers watching him, the rehearsed words simply refused to come. He opened his mouth, and what came out instead was the truth, unpolished and raw, that his wife had died of ovarian cancer when their daughter was 3, that he had spent the years since piecing together whatever work let him keep his daughter fed and held together, and somewhere in the middle of saying it, his voice cracked in a way he hadn't allowed it to crack in front of another human being in longer than he could remember. Diane Foster's expression didn't change much, but something in the room went cold and formal, the particular chill of professionals trying to be kind about something they've already privately decided disqualifies you. She said, "Of course. Thank you for sharing that, we understand," in a tone Ryan had heard enough times in his life to recognize exactly what it meant. He didn't wait for the rest of the questions. He stood up, said he appreciated their time, that he understood the position probably needed someone with more continuous recent experience, and walked out before anyone could stop him, before the humiliation sitting in his chest could climb any further up into his throat. He rode the elevator down 31 floors, replaying every second of it, cataloging every way he'd failed, already composing in his head the version of tonight where he told Sophie it hadn't worked out, again, and watched her try to hide her disappointment the careful way she always did because she'd learned far too young how to protect her father's feelings instead of the other way around. He pushed through the revolving doors onto the sidewalk and started walking, fast toward the subway, hands jammed in his coat pockets, jaw tight, and he almost didn't hear the voice behind him at all over the traffic and his own furious thoughts. "Wait," someone was shouting. "Please wait," and then again louder. "Mr. Coleman, please." And Ryan turned to see a woman in a dark tailored blazer sprinting across the lobby's glass entrance and out onto the sidewalk after him, dodging a courier and nearly losing a heel on the curb, clutching a single sheet of paper like it might blow away. It took him a moment to place her, and then it hit him that he'd seen her photograph on the company's website that morning while he researched the job. Claire Whitman, founder and CEO, the woman whose name was on the building. She reached him breathless, one hand pressed to the stitch in her side, and held up the paper, which he realized after a second was his own resume. She asked if he had really been the volunteer logistics coordinator, listed at the bottom of the page, St. Andrew's Community Food Bank, the winter 8 years ago, and something in the specificity of the question, the exact place in the exact winter, made the back of Ryan's neck go cold with a different kind of recognition. He said yes quietly. He had volunteered there 2 nights a week for almost a year before Angela got sick. Back when the food bank was on the verge of shutting its doors because their inventory system was such a disaster that half their donated food was rotting in storage before it ever reached a shelf, and he'd spent months redesigning their whole intake and rotation process for free because it was work he understood, and it felt good in a hard year to be useful to somebody. Claire Whitman stood there on the sidewalk with tears, filling her eyes in a way that made 2 people walking past actually stop and stare, and she told him, in a voice that kept catching, that her mother had brought her to that food bank every single week that winter, that her father had just lost his construction job, and their family had nothing, that she remembered standing in that building as a 14-year-old girl, embarrassed and hungry, and watching the shelves finally start, staying full and organized instead of half-empty and chaotic, watching the volunteers stop turning families away, because they'd finally figured out how to make what little they had stretch further. She said she had tried for years afterward to find out who had fixed that system, because she had always believed, in some quiet, unshakable way, that the reorganized food bank was the reason her family made it through that winter without her mother, having to choose between the electric bill and dinner, the reason she'd had enough steady meals to keep her grades up, to eventually get the scholarship that got her out, to build the company whose name was now on the very building he'd just walked out of. Nobody at St. Andrew's had ever known the volunteer's last name. She said he'd signed the intake logs only as Ryan, and she had genuinely spent years wondering about him. Had even mentioned it once in a magazine profile. The mystery volunteer, who'd quietly saved a food bank and never once asked for credit. Ryan stood on the sidewalk with his heart pounding. The humiliation of 20 minutes ago, collapsing into something else entirely, something too big and strange to name yet. Claire Whitman wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, laughed a little at herself, and said that Diane Foster had come to find her the moment he left the room, not to report on a failed interview, but because Diane had recognized the food bank's name too. Her own sister had worked there as a coordinator around the same time and had talked for years about the volunteer who fixed everything and vanished before anyone could properly thank him. Claire said she wasn't chasing him down a New York sidewalk to offer him sympathy for a hard 4 years. She was chasing him down because the numbers on his resume, the systems he'd rebuilt at that food bank with nothing but donated shelving and a stubborn refusal to let a broken process stay broken, were exactly the kind of thinking her company had spent 2 years failing to hire for. She told him the operations manager position was still his if he wanted it. But more than that, she wanted him to know that the 4 years he'd spent thinking he'd fallen behind, taking care of his wife and then his daughter and volunteering in the gaps to feel useful, had already quietly changed her life once before he ever walked through her company's doors. Ryan didn't know what to say, so for a moment he just stood there on the crowded sidewalk with traffic rushing past and let himself absorb the strange, enormous coincidence of it, the idea that some invisible, uncredited kindness he'd offered in his hardest year had been sitting patiently in another person's memory for 8 years, waiting for the moment it would circle back around to find him, standing on a curb with nothing left to lose. 2 weeks later, Ryan Coleman walked into Whitman Freight Solutions, not as a nervous applicant but as the new head of operations, and on his first morning, Claire Whitman personally walked him past a small framed photograph she kept near her office door, one Ryan had never seen before, a grainy shot of a food bank storage room from years earlier, shelves neatly labeled and organized, in a system he recognized instantly as his own handwriting on the signage. Underneath it, a small brass plate had been added just that week, engraved simply with the words, "For the volunteer who never asked to be thanked," and beneath that, quietly, his name. That evening he picked Sophie up from her after-school program And when she asked the way she always did, careful and small if today had gone okay, he knelt down on the sidewalk in front of her and told her that yes, today had gone more than okay, that sometimes the good you put into the world when nobody's watching finds its way back to you, exactly when you need it most. And that come fall, she was going to get to learn the violin after all. She wanted him to know that the 4 years he'd spent thinking he'd fallen behind, taking care of his wife and then his daughter and volunteering in the gaps to feel useful, had already quietly changed her life once before he ever walked through her company's doors. Ryan didn't know what to say, so for a moment he just stood there on the crowded sidewalk with traffic rushing past and let himself absorb the strange, enormous coincidence of it, the idea that some invisible, uncredited kindness he'd offered in his hardest year had been sitting patiently in another person's memory for 8 years, waiting for the moment it would circle back around to find him, standing on a curb with nothing left to lose. 2 weeks later, Ryan Coleman walked into Whitman Freight Solutions, not as a nervous applicant but as the new head of operations. And on his first morning, Claire Whitman personally walked him past a small framed photograph she kept near her office door, one Ryan had never seen before, a grainy shot of a food bank storage room from years earlier, shelves neatly labeled and organized, in a system he recognized instantly as his own handwriting on the signage. Underneath it, a small brass plate had been added just that week, engraved simply with the words, "For the volunteer who never asked to be thanked," and beneath that, quietly, his name. That evening he picked Sophie up from her after-school program, and when she asked the way she always did, careful and small if today had gone okay, he knelt down on the sidewalk in front of her and told her that yes, today had gone more than okay, that sometimes the good you put into the world when nobody's watching finds its way back to you, exactly when you need it most. And that come fall, she was going to get to learn the violin after all.